6 therapists quit on Elliot Voss's daughter in 11 months. 6, not 1 or 2, the kind of number you could explain away with bad luck or personality conflicts. 6 trained professionals, each with framed degrees and gentle voices and carefully worded resignation letters that all said, in different ways, the same thing. We're sorry, but we can't continue treating Becca. Elliot had read every single one of those letters at his kitchen island at 6 in the morning, standing up, still in his coat, because sitting down felt too much like surrender. His daughter was 9 years old. She hadn't spoken a full sentence to anyone outside this house since her mother left. Elliot Voss was the kind of man who fixed things. He'd built a medical device company from a rented garage in Tempe, Arizona into a nationally recognized firm with 300 employees. He'd navigated lawsuits and board revolts and a hostile acquisition attempt that had cost him 2 years and most of his hair. He solved problems with data, with structure, with the right hire at the right moment. That was who he was. He did not know what to do with a 9-year-old girl who sat in the corner of every therapist's office and drew the same thing over and over in every stitch pad he bought her. A woman walking away, seen from behind, getting smaller. Her name was Rebecca, but she'd been Becca since the day she was born. Since Elliot's wife, his ex-wife, he still stumbled over that, had held her up in the delivery room and said, "She looks like a Becca," and she had. She still did. Round-faced and serious-eyed and so much like her mother that sometimes Elliot had to look away. Camille Voss had not died. That was the part nobody wanted to say to him at dinner parties or in the hallways at Becca's school. People knew how to grieve a death, they brought food, they said the right things. They did not know what to say to a man whose wife had simply decided, one February morning, that the life she was living was not the one she wanted, and that the one she wanted did not include a daughter who needed too much, or a husband who was never home, or a house in Scottsdale that felt, she said, like a museum of choices she regretted. Camille had moved to Portland. She called on birthdays, sometimes. Becca had not cried when her mother left. That was the thing that scared Elliot most. She had stood at the living room window and watched Camille's car pull out of the driveway and she had not made a single sound. She had just watched until the car turned the corner. And then she had gone upstairs and closed her bedroom door very quietly. The way you close a door in a house where someone is sleeping. After that, she stopped talking to strangers. And then gradually, carefully, she stopped talking to most people at all. The first therapist, a woman with a PhD from Duke who specialized in childhood trauma, lasted 6 weeks. She told Elliot that Becca was resistant to traditional engagement methods. The second lasted 2 months and suggested art therapy, which was how Elliot discovered the drawings of the woman walking away. The third, fourth, and fifth he could barely distinguish from each other in his memory now. They blurred together into a montage of soft voices and fidget toys and coloring sheets, and the same question asked in different ways. "Can you tell me how that made you feel, Becca?" Becca never answered. She would pick up a marker and draw. The sixth therapist, a man named Dr. Harmon Chu, whose waitlist had been 4 months long and whose rates were such that Elliot had genuinely stopped and looked at the number twice, lasted 3 sessions. His letter was the most detailed. It included a referral to a residential program in Tucson. Elliot had put that letter in the kitchen drawer and not opened the drawer again. He was not sending his daughter to a residential program. He was not doing that. He would find another way. He always found another way. What he could not do, he was slowly painfully realizing, was be 2 places at once. The company needed him. Q3 earnings were 2 weeks out, and their largest hospital contract was up for renewal, and his VP of operations had just given notice, and the investor calls started at 7 in the morning and sometimes ran past 8 at night. He had a driver now, which he'd resisted for years because it felt like something his father would have mocked. "You can't drive yourself, Elliot?" But he needed to take calls in the car, and the calls never stopped. He had tried to be home for Becca. He had tried, genuinely tried, in the way that people try things when they know the stakes are high and still keep failing. He had eaten dinner with her 3 nights a week, or 2 nights, or sometimes 1. He had read to her before bed when he wasn't traveling. He had attended every school conference and every pediatrician appointment, and had called the school principal so many times about Becca's situation, that the principal now picked up on the first ring, but he was not there in the hours between 3 and 6 in the afternoon, which were the hours that mattered, the dead hours. After school, when the house was quiet and Becca sat at the kitchen table, with her sketchpad and her silence. He had been through 4 after-school nannies in the past year. Each one had quit for a version of the same reason. Becca wouldn't engage. She would accept a snack if it was placed in front of her. She would nod if asked a direct yes or no question. She would not make eye contact for more than 2 seconds. She would not speak. One of the nannies, a young woman from ASU who'd had every qualification Elliot's assistant had looked for, told him that being in the house with Becca felt like, and Elliot remembered her exact words because they had lodged in his chest like a splinter, like being somewhere that used to be a home. So when his housekeeper of 3 years, a woman named Dolores Paz, told him in March that her daughter-in-law had just moved back from Chicago with her 2 kids and was looking for work, Steady hours, family-friendly. She knew the house. She'd been here long enough to know how Becca liked her eggs and that she needed the blinds on the east window half open in the morning, not fully. Elliot had said yes before she finished the sentence. The daughter-in-law's name was Renata, and she came with 2 children of her own, a 13-year-old girl named Isabel and a 7-year-old boy named Marco. Elliot had not expected the children. He had not factored the children in at all. When Dolores said family-friendly, he had thought she meant early pickup for school plays and flexibility on sick days. He had not considered that family might mean the family came with her. He'd been about to clarify the arrangement when Dolores had said quietly, "Marco's a good boy. Very calm. He won't bother anyone." Elliot hadn't known what to say to that. He'd said fine. Renata Paz was 34, compact and efficient in a way that reminded Elliot of his best project managers. She moved through a space like she'd already memorized it, like she'd pre-solved every problem a room could present. She had dark eyes and a way of going still when she was thinking, and she did not make conversation for its own sake, which Elliot appreciated more than he could say. She also had ground rules, which she laid out in the kitchen on her first morning while Elliot was drinking coffee and pretending to look at his phone. "I need to bring Marco to school by 8:15 and pick him up at 3. Isabel gets herself there and back. I'll have everything done here before 3 and I'll be back by 3:30, which gives me time before you need to leave at 5. If that doesn't work, I can find coverage for Marco's pickup." It worked. Elliot told her it worked. He did not mention that he had been trying and failing to find after-school coverage for Becca for 11 months. He assumed Renata knew. Dolores would have told her. He assumed Renata had a plan. Renata did not have a plan. What Renata had was Marco. Becca did not like new people in the house. She had a system for tolerating them that Elliot had observed enough times now to recognize. She would come downstairs, assess the situation, and then find a way to make the new person understand that her presence was not an invitation. She would sit at the kitchen table with her sketch pad. She would draw without looking up. If the person spoke to her, she would not respond. If they persisted, she would take her sketch pad and go upstairs. She had never needed to go further than that. People always got the message. She came downstairs on Renata's first morning and did exactly this. Renata did not try to talk to her. Renata was cleaning the baseboards in the hallway with a focused attention that made it seem like the hallway's baseboards were the most pressing matter in the world. And she glanced at Becca once, nodded in a way that acknowledged her without demanding anything, and went back to the baseboards. Becca sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes. Then she went back upstairs. The afternoon was different because of Marco. Elliot learned about this later, piecing it together from what Renata told him and from what he could infer, because he had not been there. He had been in a conference room in downtown Phoenix arguing about contract terms. But what happened, as best he understood it, was this. Renata came back with Marco at 3:30. Marco was 7, small for his age, with his mother's dark eyes and the particular gravity that some young children have, the kind that makes adults instinctively lower their voices around them. He had a backpack covered in dinosaur stickers, and he was missing one of his front teeth, the gap giving his face an expression of permanent mild surprise. He walked into the kitchen, set his backpack down, and found Becca at the table. He looked at her drawing. She did not look up. He sat down across from her. Not next to her, across, which was far enough to not be crowding her. Close enough to see what she was drawing. Renata was in the other room. Later she would say she had been listening, the way you listen to a very young child near water. Not intrusively, just present. Marco looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he said, "Is that a person walking?" Becca's hand stopped moving on the page. She did not answer. But she did not take her sketch pad and leave. Marco reached into his backpack and pulled out a spiral notebook with a red cover. He opened it to a blank page and picked up one of the markers from Becca's collection. The dark blue one, not the black. Without asking, though he held it up first in a gesture that could have been a question. Becca did not say no. He started drawing. Elliot didn't know what he drew. That part nobody reported back to him. But they sat there together for 45 minutes, 2 children, side by side at the kitchen table, drawing in near silence. Renata said at one point Marco had asked if Becca wanted the orange marker, and Becca had said, "Yes please," which were the first words she had said to anyone outside the house in 4 months. When Elliot came home at 6:30 and walked into the kitchen, both children were still at the table. The drawings were spread out between them. Becca looked up when he came in. She always looked up for him. That was the thing that kept him going, that single small reflex of recognition. And then she looked back down, with the gap-toothed expression of mild surprise, and said, "Hi, I'm Marco. We were drawing." Elliot said hello. He looked at Renata, who was at the counter making rice, and Renata looked back at him with an expression that said, I don't know either, let it be." He set down his bag and he let it be. It didn't happen all at once. Elliot had been waiting for something to happen all at once for 11 months, and it had never worked that way. And he understood now that it wasn't going to. What happened instead was small, incremental, the way a house settles rather than collapses. Minor shifts you only notice in aggregate. By the second week, Becca was downstairs when Marco arrived. She was still at the table with her sketchpad, but she was waiting. Elliot could tell because Renata told him Becca had come downstairs 10 minutes before 3:30, which was not something she had done for anyone before. By the third week they were talking, not about anything that mattered yet, about dinosaurs mostly, which was Marco's primary subject of conversation, and apparently a subject Becca had opinions about. Elliot came home one evening to hear his daughter, through the kitchen doorway, saying flatly and with complete conviction, "Velociraptors weren't actually that big in real life. That was just the movies," and Marco saying, "Yeah, I know, but they were still fast," and Becca saying, "Well, fast doesn't make them scary, lots of things are fast." Elliot stood in the hallway for a moment with his briefcase in his hand. He did not go in, he was afraid to break something. The drawings changed. This was the thing he noticed most. Because he had been watching Becca's drawings for months the way you watch a patient's chart, looking for signs. The woman walking away got smaller. She was still there, but she was in the corner of the page now, and the rest of the page was filling in with other things. Dinosaurs for a while. Then a house that looked like a house you'd draw when you were learning to draw. Square triangle roof, 4 windows. Then what appeared to be 2 people sitting at a table. He asked Renata about it once carefully, in the way he asked about Becca's things. Obliquely from the side, because frontal attention seemed to make everything retreat. Renata thought about it for a moment. Then she said Marco doesn't ask her about her feelings. He just draws next to her. Elliot said, "That's it?" Renata said, "He's 7, he doesn't know he's supposed to fix anything." Elliot didn't say anything to that. The crisis came in the 4th week on a Thursday, which was the day Becca had started going to a new school group. A small social skills program that the school counselor had suggested. Not therapy exactly, more of a structured activity class, low pressure. It had been going fine, or what passed for fine, which was that Becca attended without visible protest. On this particular Thursday she came home and she went straight upstairs and she did not come down. Marco arrived, he looked at the empty kitchen, and then he looked at Renata, and then he went upstairs. Renata said he knocked on Becca's door twice, waited, and then said through the door, "You don't have to come out. I'm just going to draw out here for a while if that's okay." He sat down in the hallway outside her room with his notebook. After 12 minutes, Renata knew because she had been watching the clock, the way you watch a clock when you can't do anything. Becca opened the door. She sat down next to him in the hallway. He showed her what he was drawing. She didn't say anything. She got her own sketchpad from her room and came back. They sat in the hallway together for an hour. When Elliot got home that night, Renata met him at the door and told him what had happened, quietly, before he went in. He walked past the kitchen, where Renata had made dinner, past the living room with its too many surfaces, up the stairs where the carpet was still the wrong color, the color Camille had chosen. He stood in the upstairs hallway. Becca's room was empty. She was in the bathroom, he could hear water running. On the floor of the hallway pushed against the baseboard was her sketchpad, open to the last page she'd drawn on. He crouched down to look at it. He didn't pick it up. It was the woman walking away. But the woman was walking toward the edge of the paper, and the paper ended, and on this side of the paper, on the side with the space, the room, the white, there were 2 small figures sitting cross-legged on the ground. He straightened up. He stood in the hallway with his hand against the wall, and he felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was clenched. He called Camille that night. He hadn't called her in 6 months. She answered on the 3rd ring and she sounded startled. The way you sound when you've been bracing for a call you'd half convinced yourself wasn't coming. He didn't accuse her of anything. He had spent a long time in the first months, composing accusations in his head at 2 in the morning. He had imagined conversations in which she understood what she had done, in which she said the things he needed to hear. He knew now that those conversations were not the kind that happened in real life. He said, "Becca's having a good week, I thought you should know." Silence on the other end. She is? A pause. What changed? He thought about how to answer that. He thought about the right words. He thought about all the data he'd collected. The therapists, the assessments, the letters, the names on his phone that he'd stopped calling. She made a friend, he said. Camille was quiet for a moment. Then she said she hasn't done that in a long time. No, he said, she hasn't. Another silence. Her voice was different now, lower. The voice she used when she was saying something that cost her something. You don't have to, he said, and he meant it. Not because he had forgiven her, or because he hadn't. He didn't know yet, and he'd decided not to make himself know yet. He meant it because Becca had drawn 2 figures sitting in the space where the woman used to walk. He meant it because his daughter had opened a door. He said goodnight. He went and knocked on Becca's door. She said, "Come in," and he did. She was in bed with her reading light on and her sketchpad on her knees. She looked up at him the way she always looked up for him, and this time she moved over slightly, just slightly. On the bed, the universal body language of a child making room. He sat on the edge. He asked her about her day without asking about the part that was hard. She told him about Marco's theory that if velociraptors had survived they would have definitely been domesticated by now like dogs. And that she thought this was ridiculous and also correct. He listened. He was present. He was for that hour, exactly and entirely in that room. It was a start. Or maybe it was a continuation of something that had already started quietly in a kitchen at a table while he was somewhere else. Renata stayed. That felt important to say. Elliot was aware that he'd stopped assuming continuity. That every good thing came with the shadow of its ending. But 3 months passed and then 4 and she stayed. She had negotiated a small raise in month 3. Calmly and without apology, in a 2-minute conversation that Elliot had found obscurely bracing. He respected people who knew what their work was worth. Marco's visits became, without anyone formally deciding this, a fixed part of the household's rhythm. He was there Monday through Friday, 3:30 to 5:30. He had strong opinions about what snack was appropriate at 3:30 versus 4 o'clock. He had named the 2 succulents on the kitchen windowsill, which Elliot hadn't known about until Becca mentioned it in passing. Marco says the short fat one is Gerald and the taller one is Gerald's cousin. Elliot had looked at the succulents. He'd had them for 3 years without naming them. What's Gerald's cousin's name? He'd asked. Becca had looked at him with an expression that suggested this was a strange question. Also Gerald, she'd said. They're cousins, not the same person. He had laughed at that. Really laughed. The kind that catches you off guard and is half relief. Becca had watched him with the quiet intensity she brought to everything, and then the corner of her mouth had moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something adjacent to one. It was the closest she'd come in a long time. The 7th therapist on the list that Dr. Harmon Chu had given him was a woman named Dr. Patricia Elmore. She worked with children who had experienced parental abandonment. Not her language, that was the language of the intake form. And she was in a small office in Tempe with a succulent collection of her own and a sand tray in the corner. Elliot had made the appointment in month 2, when Becca was still refusing to speak to anyone. He had not cancelled it, because the thought of canceling felt too much like giving up. He rescheduled it instead twice and then a 3rd time. He took Becca in month 5. She looked around the office. She looked at the succulents. She looked at the sand tray which had small figures in it. A house, some trees, a number of animals arranged in a group facing each other. Dr. Elmore said hello. She did not ask Becca how she was feeling. She asked if Becca had a preference about where to sit. Becca looked at the 2 chairs and the couch. She sat on the couch. She did not draw anything that session. She did not say much. But at the end when they were leaving she stopped at the shelf of small figures near the sand tray and picked one up. It was a small figure of a child, kneeling on the ground, and next to it there was a dog and she looked at it for a moment. She put it back exactly where it had been. Same time next week, Dr. Elmore said to both of them. Becca looked at her for the first time that session. It was a long look, the kind she gave things she was deciding about. Okay, she said. Elliot heard the word and kept his face still. He was learning to do that. To receive good things without flinching, without the reflex of reaching for them too hard and scaring them off. Okay, he said. The school year ended in May. Becca had one friend from the social skills group, a quiet girl named Alice, who was also 9 and also serious, and who communicated largely through texting on a borrowed tablet, which Becca considered an extremely reasonable form of communication. They had been texting each other for 6 weeks. Elliot had read none of the texts which had required discipline, and which he was proud of. Marco was finishing 2nd grade. Renata told Elliot he was being moved up to the advanced reading group which Elliot found, and expressed to Renata genuinely impressive, because Marco's preferred reading material was a 40-year-old field guide to prehistoric reptiles that he had checked out from the school library. So many times the librarian had put his name on a slip inside the cover. On the last day of school, Becca came home and went straight to the kitchen table. Elliot worked from home that day. He did it on purpose. He had put it in his calendar in March and fought to keep it clear, which had required 3 separate conversations with his assistant, and one with his VP of strategy, who had wanted to schedule a dinner with a potential acquisition target, and kept saying Friday's the only time they're free until Elliot said, with a finality he did not usually deploy in those conversations, Friday doesn't work for me. He was home when Marco arrived at 3:30, which was unusual, and Marco noticed immediately. You're here, Marco said. I am, Elliot said. Marco considered this. Do you want to draw? Elliot looked 7 years old, gap-toothed, completely serious. Sure, Elliot said. They sat at the table, the 3 of them. Renata put orange slices and peanut butter on the table, which was apparently the correct 3:30 snack. Becca did not say anything about Elliot being there, which was not the same as minding. They drew. Elliot was not good at it. He drew the kind of things engineers draw, which is to say shapes with too much precision and no warmth. Marco looked at his drawing and said, That's a house with the solemnity of a diagnosis. It's a house, Elliot agreed. It needs a door, Marco said. Becca, without looking up from her own drawing, said, It needs windows. Nobody draws windows. Elliot drew windows. He drew 4 of them, 2 on each side of the door that Marco had specified. He drew a tree, badly, which looked more like broccoli, and Marco immediately identified it as broccoli, and Becca made the sound she made that was not quite a laugh but was in the same neighborhood. It was the smallest possible version of an afternoon. 3 people at a table with orange slices and bad drawings, and a 7-year-old's considered opinions about prehistoric reptiles and architectural requirements. Elliot thought about the 6 therapists. He thought about the letters, the residential program referral sitting in the closed drawer. He thought about Camille's car pulling out of the driveway and Becca, standing at the window, not making a sound. He thought about all the problems he had tried to solve with the right hire at the right moment, and then he stopped thinking about it. Because Becca had pushed her drawing to the center of the table. It was the 2 figures again, the cross-legged ones, sitting in the space where the woman used to walk, except now there were 3 figures. The third one was taller. It was sitting with them. She had not said it was him. She hadn't said it was anything. She'd just pushed it to the center of the table where everyone could see it, and picked up a new marker and started working on something else. Elliot looked at the drawing for a moment. Then he looked at his broccoli tree house with its 4 windows and its door. He picked up the orange marker, the one Marco had once asked Becca's permission to use, the one that had started it, and he added something small and unimportant and warm to his drawing. He didn't show anyone. He didn't need to. He was present, and for now that was everything.